guys like being in the middle where you get about the same time?
It started at number 5. I can mix it up. It started at number 5 before.
I have my instructions.
Oh, okay. Is that in the Constitution?
In the DCA Constitution.
Rob, you can't suspend that rule.
Okay, the questions start getting a little bit longer, so if any of the candidates want me to reread it, I'd be happy to do so. Question number 3. Assuming the current level of governmental regulation of the private sector, do you believe there should be more, less, or the same level of control and oversight?
Well, I think it depends sometimes on what the issue is. I think if we had greater oversight over Wall Street and the mega banks in this country, we wouldn't have had the Great Recession that we had. There's a lot of things that could have been done a lot differently, and there was a loosening of regulation, frankly, that prior Congresses did that had led to some of our economic problems. I think if we had more regulation of offshore oil rigs, we might not have had the incident that happened off of New Orleans with the BP rig explosion. I think that it's important to have regulation for food safety. We have outbreaks of salmonella across the country. So in certain areas, we definitely need to make sure we've got proper regulation. At the same time, we need to balance that. We need to make sure that those that are doing the regulating are not looking out to be the cop necessarily that's smacking someone on the wrist. But if it's working with a business, it's helping them to comply, or helping them to get to the right place, in being almost an ombudsman at some point. I've talked to many businesses who are frustrated to some extent at certain regulations. I think it's a balancing that we need to do. We need to make sure we've got safety, food safety, environmental regulations, but at the same time we need to make sure that those that are doing the regulating are not necessarily being punitive unless it's warranted, but helping people meet those regulations. Thank you.
Joe Christoforski.
I'm going to agree with Robert on one thing, and that's we do need some type of regulation, right? But we don't need to be over-regulated. Right? 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act to regulate the financial industry, to prevent banks from going into insurance companies going into banking, brokerage houses going into banking going into brokerage houses. That was repealed in 1999. Congress repealed it almost unanimously, and that led us down the road to what happened, our fiscal economy, near collapse of the economy. If Glass-Steagall had been in place, I believe that we would not have had as severe an impact as we had. Now, Dodd-Frank, on the other hand, is too big. Dodd-Frank over-regulates. It's going to create 300, 400 agencies out of Dodd-Frank, one of which will have the power to declare any company as being too big to fail. Not just a bank, but any company, and the government going in and taking over that company. That's near dictatorship. That's not a free market, and that's not what America's all about. The EPA, no one in this room, I think, will argue that we did not need environmental protection in the 70s. I grew up in the 70s when that smog layer used to lay over Los Angeles, New York City, and other cities. Right? Our water, the river right by my house when I was growing up was polluted. The smell from it, you couldn't even sit outside at night because of the smell from the river. So we needed some regulation, but we don't need over-regulation. I was with a group in Allegheny County, a builder who was going to build on some land in Cumberland, and he dug a well. EPA regulations required that he test that well within 24 hours. But when he tested the well, the arsenic level was too high, and the EPA said you can't build. If he waited a week to test that well after everything settled, so when you drill, the matter goes into the bottom of the well. All right, if he waited a week to test it, he would have been able to drill. All right, he tested it himself a week later. No arsenic levels, no pollutant levels, no contamination. He's now filing a complaint with the EPA. So we need some regulation, but not over-regulation.
Ron Little.
I think like everything else, it's about balance. We're not going to be able to function without, certain activities being regulated. And that's one of the things that I feel like I'm an expert in. As an antitrust attorney, I recognize when things are going to get too big and be harmful, to the public. And I think as rational people, to the extent that, we're rational and we're not spending our time arguing with each other about whose policy it is, we can identify where that balance needs to exist. Yeah, we have a tendency to over-regulate some things in response to, maybe some public health scares. And, we start to worry about maybe we're not paying enough attention. We obviously did not pay enough attention to the banking industry or the housing industry. And maybe we haven't been paying as much attention as we needed to to the EPA. You know, it's about balance. So, you know, yes, you know, we're not going to be able to say, you know, we'll deregulate this area and we'll increase regulations here, but I think understanding that those regulations need to exist, and we just need to be mindful of how much regulation we infuse into, you know, different environments, whether it's the public sector, private sector, or otherwise, that those regulations are there to protect the public, because that's what our responsibility is as congressmen, to protect the public.
Peter James.
And again, I would generally answer less. I have a renewable energy farm. I'm very much into the environment and all that. But it depends on the jurisdiction. If it's within a state, I've looked into processing fish. And we, believe me, have a very good health, food health thing in Maryland that can take care of that. Now when it comes to crossing state lines or offshore and that sort of thing, there is a role under the Constitution to regulate those things. Particularly, you know, we had regulatory laws in place for Wall Street and the housing crisis and all that, and that's part of the problem of centralizing it, because you get this revolving door of, you know, Goldman Sachs. I think the chief of staff at the White House is Citi Group or whatever. They're running things. Really, going back to the main point of this election is the economy and jobs. And when you really understand why we lost all those jobs, why people went out of business, why there was foreclosures, is because the banks stopped lending money into existence. So there wasn't enough money going around to put into everybody's paychecks. Just like musical chairs, somebody lost your chair, okay? So you're going to lose your house, lose your business, lose your job. The banks, if they wanted to, back in 2008, there was $800 billion of monetary base. Now there's $2.4 trillion of monetary base, and instead of the bankers loaning it out to buy a home or start a business or improve your business or put into paychecks, they're decided they want to pay themselves interest on that excess reserves. So Congress isn't in control. What Congress needs to do is, like Andrew Jackson, like Thomas Jefferson, kill the central bank, bring back the power to issue money to the federal government and the people where it belongs.
John Mulaney.
Thank you. As I said earlier, I believe the government has a role in our society, and I think regulating our business in our society, regulating commerce in our society is important to protect the needs of our citizens, because they're not in a position to do it themselves, and they need the government to do it. I also think this question between regulations and jobs is often a false choice, because I think we can have good, smart, consistent regulations that result in job growth and good economic return. A great example of this is the Clean Air Act, which when implemented was vilified by business, right? And if you look at the performance of the Clean Air Act since it's been implemented, there's been a 25 times savings between healthcare costs and the cost of the regulation. So putting aside that it improved the lives of every American, we've been paid back 25 times the cost of implementing that regulation between savings and healthcare costs. So I think good regulation is very consistent with good job growth. I agree with the President's position, however, on what kind of government we need. He said, I think in a very clear and persuasive manner, that the government we have today is not necessarily the government we need for the next century. That's why the President is working so hard to streamline our government, make it as efficient as possible, and put it in a position so that it regulates effectively and it's easy for business and the private sector to intersect with it. A lot of people have talked about banking. One of the problems we've had in this country is we've had 4 banking regulators, right? So different banks are regulated by different regulators. There wasn't kind of a comprehensive approach to banking regulation. Why? No one's ever been able to answer that. It's just a historical legacy that we can't seem to break. So I think the President has shown very good leadership about thinking about our government, understanding what our citizens need in terms of protection and regulation, and making sure government is lined up with the interest of the people, but that government's also easy to work with, not only for the citizens, but our businesses who are creating jobs. Thank you.
Dr. Gilad Kunar.
So I look at everything from a standpoint of just common sense. I think none of us really like the idea of regulations in our personal life or in our businesses. It frankly rankles. But the truth of the matter is that government does play a critical role in protecting our common interests. If we hadn't removed all the regulations of the banking industry, we probably could have avoided the worst of the crash in 2008. The role of the government is to play the umpire. It's to play the referee in a free market. It's to call the balls and strikes fair and foul. It's to create a level playing field so that the competitors can compete in a common market, so that no one gets the idea that they should really try to cheat someone else out of their best interest. And so I think government does play a critical role. Government does play a critical role in public health, in enforcing certain vaccinations and requiring them for kids to go to school. Because at the end of the day, those have economic benefits for the entire country. If our entire job force is out with the measles, we don't see the measles anymore because of vaccinations. Let me tell you, I've been in parts of Africa where they still have measles. It destroys the economy. So it is a national security issue. And when it plays, the government has a role to protect our common interests, to protect our national security. Thank you very much.
Happy as follows.